Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be looking at yet another post-design process. And this time we're going to be looking at how to additive manufacture our designs. So again, let's jump into Fusion and give it a go. So once we're in Fusion and we've got our design open, the first thing we're going to do is preparing this design to actually be manufactured. This is something that OCR really look for in the coursework in terms of pushing up to those higher marking bands. So at the minute, this design, we're not going to try and 3D print every single one of these components. That just wouldn't be viable. And some of them are like things like steel screws. So again, that's not going to be made using a conventional 3D printer. So the thing that we would 3D print on this design is probably this main body section at the back. Obviously, you'd probably 3D print the lid as well at the end, but at the minute, we're just going to focus on that one. So the way to do this is rather than hiding all of these, what we can do is actually make a separate file just with this component. And the way to do this is by finding it within your browser, right clicking on it, and then select Save Copy As. And this just allows you to make a file as just that component itself. So I'm just going to call this 3D print CPD tutorial. Actually got the spelling right first time for once. So now it's made the file. So all we need to do is go into our data panel. Sometimes you may need to click refresh at the top, but that file should now be in there wherever you've saved it. So now all we have to do is open this file. So as you can see, it's just a file with just that component in. So I'm just going to hide my sketches for now, just because we don't need those. So we're still not quite ready to 3D print this. So the reason for this is if I just click on one of these edges, I can see down at the bottom right that that is 200 millimeters. And I know that the 3D printers that we have in our school, the print bed isn't quite large enough for that design. So there's a couple of ways you can try and work around this. One of them is to actually scale down your model. You can do this by going to Modify and selecting Scale. Select the entities that you want to scale down, and then you can change the scale factor as a ratio. But I'm not actually going to do that on this model, and there is a reason why. So if I just look at this from this front-on view, if I click on this edge here, now the reason why those are there is to hold those speakers in place. And those speakers are actually standard subcomponents that we order in. So changing the scale of this would naturally work for our design. So there's other things that you can do. So one of them is to actually split that body and print it as two separate entities instead. So what I'm going to do is create a sketch. I'm going to do it on the front of this face. And I'm just going to use the line function. And I'm just going to cut somewhere down the middle. And I'm just going to click Finish Sketch. Now, again, because I have sketches hidden, I'm just going to show them again. And then all we need to do is go to Modify, select Split Body, and choose the body to split. It's the only one we have, so it's a pretty obvious one. And then what we're going to do is select that line that we've created as the splitting tool. And it's going to use this red circle just to show where it's chopping that model. I'm fine with that, so I'm just going to click OK. So what we can now do is we've got main body and main body one within our browser. So I'm just going to decide to remove one of these just for now. So I'm just going to remove that. And then later on when I'm printing it again, I can just remove the other one and print that other side. You can also go back on your timeline and remove that and then print the other side as well. So I'm just going to save that file just for now. And I'm just going to hide those sketches once again. So we're now ready to take this over to the manufacturer workspace. So to do this, select design and go over to manufacture. So one of the first things it's going to do is it's going to change this toolbar along the top. Again, Orbit does a few extra ones, but we've still got these general ones like Orbit and Pan. So because we're using a 3D printer, we need to make sure that we're in the additive workspace rather than any of the other ones. Again, it's going to give us our tools along the top, and we're going to try and work from left to right along here. So the first thing we need to do is actually set up our print. So I'm going to select new setup, and it's going to give me this dialog box just to the right. And also if we look at our model, it's going to place it on the print bed. So that print bed is quite small and it's not quite the one that we use at the school. So first thing is to go to select machine, and it's going to open up this library of printers that are compatible with Fusion. Now you can also use search at the top because there is quite a lot of printers on there. You can also narrow down your searches by the type of printer that you're using. But if your printer isn't on there, don't panic because there is a generic printer in this library. But also, if you email Autodesk and say that you'd like your printer to be on there, they are extremely good and very fast with getting your printer on there in that library as well. So, for example, our one in the school is the Dremel 3D40. Not the most amazing printer, but still good for what we use. And that wasn't on there. And we contacted Autodesk. Within a week, it was up there. So I'm going to select that as my printer. So straight away, you can see it's got the print bed that matches the one that's in our printer. Then we're going to go over to print settings and we're going to select the filament that we use. Also, if there's a printer that you're using over and over again and a filament, if you go to recent, it's just going to store those ones that you use. It just makes things a bit more efficient. So I'm going to select this PLA. There's also a few other settings here, but at the minute, these are all completely fine. You don't really have to play around with those too much. So I'm just going to click OK. So again, moving along this toolbar, the next thing we've got is positioning our model. So for those eagle-eyed viewers, you've probably noticed that this is probably not the best orientation to have this model on. So if I go to position, you can do things like minimize build height and it will try and automatically calculate the best part to do. You can also do place parts on platform just in case it's floating. And you can do automatic orientation, which tries to optimize it. So I'm going to select that one and I'm just going to see what it gives me. So I'm going to select move components and do this manually. So I'm going to select our component and I'm just going to use this dial to rotate it around. And I'm going to get it down to 90. And I'm just going to move that down to the origin. Again, you can use different angles on your view cube to do this. And I'm just going to slide this along so it's in the middle of our print. So once you've got it in place, you can then go to support and you can choose either a solid volume support, which is obviously going to help with the accuracy of any parts that are floating, or you can do a solid bar support. So it's using a lot less filament, and with students talking about that, you can then talk about things like sustainability and cost with using less material. So I'm just going to select solid support bar, and you can select the angle that it needs and you can avoid certain parts as well. So at the minute, I'm just going to select the model and click OK. I'm going to automatically generate those supports. So what I'm then going to go to is move on to actions. So this is now where we're starting to generate how we actually want to use those toolpaths. So again, it does this quite automatically. Just select generate, and it's going to ask you about, do you want to do the operation anyway? I'm just going to select yes, and then it'll just give us this tick just to show that it's actually started to generate those different toolpaths. Then what you can go to is simulate. So once we move into the manufacturer workspace, you'll notice that our toolbar. So once we're in this manufacturing workspace, you'll notice that along our so once we're in the manufacturer workspace, we need to make sure that we're in the additive environment on the top. And there are a few more tools along this at the bottom, but you don't need to look at that too much. We have also got the ones that we're used to, like orbit and pan. So the first thing we're going to need to do is, again, using this left to right. Then once we're in the manufacturer workspace, the first thing we're going to need to do is make sure we're in the right environment. So we need to be in the additive workspace. And then you'll notice on our tools along the bottom, there is a few new ones like machine visibility, but there are also those ones that we're used to, like orbit and pan. Again, we're going to try and use this left to right workflow. And so the first thing we're going to do is a new setup. So it's going to put our print and our model on this print bed. But at the minute, that's tiny. It's not really what we're looking for. So we need to select the machine that we're going to use. So it's going to open up this library of different 3D printers. There is a ridiculous amount of these. So you can use the search bar at the top left. Also, it might be that your 3D printer isn't there. Now, there's two ways around this. You can just use one of the generic ones. But what's really beneficial with Autodesk is that you can actually message them and request that they put your 3D printer on there. And they are really quick with this. I think we got ours on there within a week. Also, once you start using your machine and you're selecting it quite often, if you go to recent, yours will be there and it just makes things a lot quicker. So I'm just going to select the one we've got in our school. So straight away, this workspace has changed slightly and it's actually given us the print bed of the machine that we're using. Next is to select the print settings. So this is simply what filament are we going to use? You can also narrow down your searches depending on which sort of printer you're using. So again, I'm just going to go to recent and select the filament that we use. There are a few other settings here, but generally you don't have to touch those. So it is quite quick and easy. So I'm just going to select OK. And what it's going to do, it's going to put this print within this print bed and this workspace. So the next thing we need to do is position this model, because at the minute, that's not really the best way to try and print this. So if we go over to position, we can manually move components. We can do things like trying to minimize build height. We can do an automatic orientation, and you've got print parts, and we've got place parts on platform. That's just in case we've got anything that's floating just above. So I'm just going to select move components to manually move this first. And I'm just going to use this dial to rotate it around. And then I'm just going to click OK. Sometimes you might need to use a combination of these. So again, I've just rotated that round and then placed it on the platform. So I'm just going to save that now just so it remembers that setup and that placement. Then you can go on to supports. Now, this is where your students can talk about a couple of different things in order to boost the marks even further. So the first one is that solid volume support. So if you've got any parts or any pieces of a print that are floating, they're going to be a bit more accurate if they've got a solid support underneath them. But if you use something like solid bar support, your students can talk about sustainability and saving on costs because it's using considerably less material to do that. So I'm just going to care about the planner and select solid bar support. I'm going to select the model that I'm using. You can also change the support angle. I'm just going to leave it at 40. That's pretty good. And I'm going to click OK. And it's just going to give me this little thing here telling me that it's actually running that support. So I'm just going to give it a minute or so just to actually load those supports. Then it's going to give me this tick just to tell me that it's valid and it's done. So what I need to do now is actually try and generate some toolpaths for printing this. So I'm going to go to actions and I'm going to select generate. And I'm going to click yes. And again, it's just going to try and generate some toolpaths and how it's actually going to print this. So once we're in the manufacturer workspace, you'll notice that there are a few extra ones along this at the bottom, but we have also got some of the ones that we're used to, like orbit and pan. So some of these are more just to do with showing and viewing different manufacturer things like your machine visibility. And again, what we're going to do is work along this toolbar at the top from left to right. So we're going to start with setup and we're going to select new setup. So this is just allowing us to choose what printer we're using and what filament. So we're going to select our machine from here. And it's going to open up this Fusion 360 library. So you can narrow down your searches by selecting what type of manufacturing we're doing and also what type of printer it is. So there is loads to choose from. So there is a search bar at the top left to make it easier. If your printer isn't on there, don't panic because there is a couple of generic printers. But what I'd suggest doing is what's really good with Autodesk is if you reach out to them, they will work back with you. So our printer wasn't on there and we spoke to them, and within a week, our printer was on there. So don't be afraid to drop them a message. So I'm just going to go with the printer we've got. Also, once you keep using that printer, what it's going to do is remember that, and in your recent folder on the top left, it just makes it a bit more efficient for selecting the printer you've got. So just double click on it, and again, it's going to actually add the print bed of your printer. Print settings, we're going to select now. Again, in recent, it's going to keep track of the ones that we're using quite often. So I'm just using PLA for this one. There are also a few extra settings there, but again, these are all automated and it's really accurate. So I just leave those as they are. So click OK, and it's going to add this on the print bed. But looking at this, it's not really the best way to actually print this. So the next one along our toolbar is actually position. So we're going to go to position, and there's different ways that we can move around and set up the orientation of this build. There's automatic, we can minimize build height. We've also got place parts on the platform. So if we've got one that's just floating about in open space, we can move that down. Sometimes you might need to use a combination of these just to get things right. So I'm going to go with move components first. So this is a manual way of doing it. I'm going to spin that dial around, click OK. And then again, as this is floating, I'm just going to do place parts on platform, select it, and click OK. And it's just going to move that onto the platform. You may have to move your view cube around just to make sure it's in place. So I'm quite happy with how that looks now. So I'm going to go over to supports. So there's two different options for this, and you can get students to talk about why you choose these different options. So solid volume is going to allow it to be a bit more accurate if we've got one of those floating sections, but this is going to use up quite a lot of material, so it's going to increase the costs and it's not going to be as sustainable. So we're going to select solid bar support instead, which uses almost like these little chopsticks to keep those in place. Select the model that we're using and click OK. And it's just going to tell me that it's generating those. So give it a few seconds just to spin that wheel. And then it should come up with a green tick like so. And it actually displays those supports and where it's going to put them. So what we need to do now is, now that we've got some support, we need to go over to actions, and we actually need to generate that toolpath. So how is the printer actually going to make this? So we're going to select generate. We're going to select yes. Again, it's just going to tell me when it's done along here. So once we're in the manufacturing workspace, you'll notice we've got a few extra ones along the bottom here. A lot of those are just to do with the visuals of the manufacturing environment, like stock visibility, machine visibility, things like that. But we have still got the ones that we're used to, like orbit, pan, and zoom. Again, we've still got a browser on the left, but it's slightly different, but still the same principles. And along the top, we need to make sure that we're in the correct manufacturing environment. So we need to be in additive. And we're going to use this left to right workflow still. So what we're going to do first is create a new setup. So in the dialog box, we need to select the different configurations of this print. So firstly, we're going to select our machine, and it's going to take you to this Autodesk library of different printers. You can also narrow down your searches by what type of manufacturing you're doing, maybe what type of printer we're using. And because there is quite a lot to choose from, there is also a search option on the top left. Now, if your printer isn't on there, don't panic because there is a couple of generic printers. But what I'd recommend doing is do that as at first, but write to Autodesk, and what they're amazing at is sorting out things for you. So, for example, our printer wasn't on there. We messaged Autodesk, and within a week, our printer was on there. And once you start using that printer, it's going to actually store it in this recent near the top left. So again, just makes it a bit more efficient and a bit quicker when you're selecting the printer that you use. So we're going to select Dremel, and also we need to select our print settings. So what filament are we going to use for this print? Again, it's going to give you this library. I'm just going to go to recent and select PLA. So there are also a few other options along here that you can play around with, but generally they are already exactly how you'd want them. So I'm just going to click OK there. And it's going to actually change this print bed and this print environment up so it actually matches the printer that you've set it as. But what you eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed is that the orientation of this model isn't actually the most efficient way we could print this. So lucky for us, the next one along that toolpath is actually to position our component. So we can manually move that component, and there's a couple of automatic ones, so it can optimize it or it can try and minimize that build height. I'm just going to go with move components for now. I'm going to select the component to move, and I'm just going to use the dial to rotate it round. Click OK. And when you're doing this, you might need to use a combination of a couple of different ones. So now that I've rotated it, I just need to stop this from floating about. So I'm going to select that and click OK. And it's just going to move it to that print bed. You may also need to flick around your view cube just to make sure it's in place as well. And then the next thing that we need to do is, if we look at this small section here, that's not going to print unless we add some supports. So I'm going to go to supports, and there's two options here. There's solid volume support, which, as it says on the tin, it's just going to print a solid block of support. And the other option is solid bar support. So it's almost like these little chopsticks that it uses. Now, you can get your students to boost their grades up by talking about why you'd select one or the other. So solid volume is going to allow those floating sections of your print to be a lot more accurate, but it will make removing that material sometimes more difficult. And also it's not quite as sustainable, and it's going to increase costs if we're using all that extra material for support. So I'm going to save the planet and the environment and select solid bar support instead. It's going to ask us to select which part of the model. So you can select individual parts, or you can just select the entire model. So to keep things easy, I'm just going to select the entire model. You can also avoid putting supports in certain areas if that's what you'd like. And you can select a support overhang as well. So I'm just going to leave it at 40 degrees and click OK. In your browser, it's just going to tell you that it's loading those, and it's going to come up with this green tick when it's done. And we can actually see this on the model. So next, we're actually going to need to generate the printer actually carrying out this toolpath. So we're going to go to Actions and we're going to select Generate. It's going to give us a quick message about generating that toolpath. So I'm just going to click Yes. Again, give it a few seconds, and in your browser, it will then tell you whether that toolpath is done. Then once it's done, it's either going to give us a green tick or sometimes an orange warning. So it gives you a display of the error messages. So red is when it completely can't do it. And if it's given us an orange or sometimes yellow one, it's just going to give us a little quick warning. And it doesn't mean it can't do it. It's just trying to tell you that something could possibly go wrong. So all it's telling us is that the print bed temp has been reduced to the max. So I'm fine with that, so I'm just going to click close. And then next along our actions is to actually simulate this toolpath. So again, really good for boosting students' grades because they can talk about how simulating things is industry 4.0 and it's testing whether it's right before we make those mistakes. So to look through your simulation, you can either click play down at the bottom and it will run through it, or you can use this arrow and drag through the separate actual layers. Once you're done, simply click post-process and we can start to save that G-code. So you can choose what you're going to call that file and where you're going to save it by selecting your output folder. I'm happy with what it's called and where it's saving, so I'm just going to select. So now that that's done, you can then, so if you really wanted to, you could actually open up that G-code on a document and get your students to annotate it, or you can just save it onto a USB and send that straight over to the printer. So that's all for today's video. Hope you found it really useful and you've started to develop some skills in the manufacturing environment. And thank you for your time.